Thank you so much. This panel is made up of quite a strange coalition of different people. Rather than me do a terrible job of trying to introduce and describe anybody, I'm just going to ask you each to describe yourselves, if you wouldn't mind. And I'll just go down with you, John, to start.
Hello again. I'm John Wallace. I'm a video artist and filmmaker. Live locally, born in Dumfries.
I'm Judy Hewitt, the Museums Curator for Dumfries and Galloway Council Arts and Museum Service.
Use this one? Yeah, it is on. I'm Karen Goodwin. I'm a journalist. I'm a co-editor for a not print online investigations platform called The Ferret. But I started my journalistic career in print, and I still remember that smell that was being described.
My name's Johnny Geely, and I work out of the Blueprint, which is a Riso studio based in Leith in Edinburgh.
I'm Pete Fortune. I recently retired after 20 years in social work, currently spend time writing fiction. I'm here tonight essentially because I spent the first 25 years of my life as a compositor, working in hot metal essentially, and my father and grandfather before me worked in the biddies as well. So I'm the museum piece proper.
Living heritage, I would like to put it. So we've just seen the collection of short films by yourself, John. I'll start with a wee kind of post-film debrief. Can you tell me, how did you approach the storytelling aspect of the films in order to capture the essence of the people, the industries, and the skills involved in the print industry in Dumfries?
I'm entirely, I think as I said earlier, indebted to John and to Mac. That's John Roney and Mac Creedon that you saw in that film. They actually worked together in Dinwiddies, and they're absolute fount of knowledge. So several attempts at interview with them, sort of a good couple of hour sessions with them both, and then just really boiling the audio that you heard down from that. And following up other leads. They were really great with all the ephemera as well. Various friends and family members came up with all the bits and bobs that went into the exhibition. And then beyond that, it was just really a lot of time with the camera in Dinwiddies itself, looking at the traces of what had been left. Something that's not in the film, but when that was taken over by Curry's in the 80s, I think you were telling me, they just closed off the whole of the top of the building. So the upper stories were basically as they had been, and are still like that, just as they had been abandoned as Dinwiddie Greaves sold the building on. They had no use. I actually had to send these 80-year-old guys, including Dr. Dinwiddie, up a ladder and through a hatch to access the top stories of the building. So, and aside from that, a bit of work in the York Library, looking through some of the stuff that they had there.
I think what really comes across in the film as well is the use of sound and the sort of the machinery, and you really get a sense of the senses and the actual life that was there. And Pete, you obviously worked within, was it both Dinwiddies and apologies?
I worked for Grieve the Printers, and the company's amalgamated became Dinwiddie Grieve. But that was a hugely nostalgic experience, seeing that. And you talk about lived experience. Well, I sat here and relived that experience. I could almost smell the smells that John was describing.
Amazing. Were there any, I suppose, John, any unexpected discoveries or stories that emerged during the making of the film that particularly resonated with you? Or did you feel that you really kind of got a full sense of that world of the printing industry?
I think it was a great bonus to be able to work in that building so much, because it's not very difficult. I mean, you see that picture of William Crothers in the machine room that pops up in the film, and you know the old white brick ceramic bricks are all still in there, and then to take the sound of the machinery and play it back out in there as part of the exhibition, you could almost smell it. Just on the smell as well, my mum used to run a small printing business in the house. So I grew up with the smell of Gestetner ink and stencils and the sound of duplication going on as well. So just talking to these guys about the technology that was involved and how they did it was really transported me as well. So in terms of unexpected stories, what I didn't expect was to find things like the old greeting cards that are kicking about there, and there is still a card index sitting up this 2 card indexes sitting up the stairs there with all the listings of all the poetry pamphlets. I didn't manage to rescue it from the building, but I really hope they've been kept safe. So,
yeah, I've seen them too. It's really quite it's just this like fragment of time, or an imprint in time, rather. Yeah. I'd like to bring in Judith. So you have a current exhibition, which kindly has involved this Off the Margin Microfest. On Tuesday, you held the Printing History of Dumfries, a talk. Can you tell us about the museum exhibit, Fighting for Justice, Strikes and Protests in Dumfries, 1770 to 1920, that's currently on, and how does this connect with or relate to the printing and newsprint heritage in the town?
Sure, thanks. Well, the exhibition is all about working people's lives, struggles, protests, and I think when I first thought about the exhibition, it was inspired by a piece of print. So it was inspired by Ian Gass's leaflet and also by his magnificent tome, his chunky book, Mobbing, Struggles and Strikes. So that's kind of how it came to be initially. But also it's something when you think about that period of time, you think about violence in the streets, you think about riots, you think about really active protests or political demonstrations. You don't necessarily think that happened here. You think that happened in Paris or London or Manchester or places like that. You think that our rights were fought for in other places, but they weren't. They were fought for right here. And that's the wonderful thing about this exhibition, is exploring the agency of the people of the past in our locality. And one of the things that struck me in the book, Ian's book, there was a reference, and it's also in McDowell's History of Dumfries, a reference to, in 1771, overnight, a poster appeared on the King's Arms Tavern, and that's now Boots. And the poster said, essentially, that the people who were trading food and exporting food from Dumfries should desist in their sinful actions because they were robbing the poor of this town of their own food. They were exporting it to make a profit at the expense of the people of the town. And this was a time when people were starving. The justice they were fighting for was the right to feed themselves and feed their families. So it wasn't some abstract, lofty ideal. It was the very basis of survival. So this poster appeared on the King's Arms saying, stop exporting food, stop exploiting the people of Dumfries, or your house will be burnt down, or your ears will be cut off. So quite an extreme threat of violence. It appeared in the middle of the night, posted on the King's Arms Hotel. No one knows who printed it, but the idea that there was that print culture at the time, and I thought, oh, cracking, these things existed. Let's get them in the exhibition. Let's find one in the Ewart Library, but they do not exist. So it's ephemera. The very nature of so much print is ephemeral. The very moment in time that captured and that represented has been lost. So we worked with Kate Ross, John Ronnie and Mac at Solway Print to recreate some of these posters and have that print actually present in the museum as well as the creative process behind it. So time and time again throughout the exhibition, it's about working people, it's about their ideas, it's about how they manifested those ideas, and print just came out time and time and time again as a theme, as well as being the very first trade union in Dumfries was a typographical union. So the printers themselves were unionising and organising and then enabling others to organise and communicate and fight for those rights. So those are some of the themes of the exhibition, and print is just omnipresent throughout all of it, essentially.
Perhaps you should send one of those posters to Alistair Jack.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating when you're saying about the sort of how localized the history is and how often it's disenfranchised or disengaged with the larger political strife and the globalization that we tend to think of things like strikes and grand revolutionary movements, but they often happen and even in places like Dumfries, and I think they're doing a remarkable job in the curation of this to really highlight those elements. And if I can bring in Pete in terms of just exactly that heritage is, often the story surrounding print is that of the industry, that of the kind of, it's an industrial heritage. Yet I think, given what Judith was saying there about the kind of other aspects of the localized history, is we often overlook the rich community and the fabric of that, and woven into that history. And how would you characterise that community or that, working within the print? And were there any particular traditions associated around it that we have lost?
I think one of the things that first come to mind regarding print, especially back in the letterpress days, is how esoteric, how mysterious it was, because people didn't really understand the mechanics, what actually was entailed in putting together a piece of print. Now everyone's got a desktop, everyone's their own printer, so there was that sense of almost sort of mystery. When I started as a compositor, I think my young friends thought I was going to be writing songs. That's the only thing they could kind of glean from it. So there was a sense of almost fellowship, because we were involved in something that was quite unique, quite unusual compared to other occupations perhaps. And of course historically there was a degree of elitism, because historically a lot of working class people were illiterate, but printers by their very nature of what they're doing were obviously quite literate. So there was a standoffish, there was a sort of sense of being quite separate. There was a pride, and it did manifest itself in a healthy way through strong trade union organisation. That's what I do recall. That's pretty much gone now. I mean, printing still takes place, but there is no mistake about it. And I would hazard a guess that in 20, 30, 40 years' time, no one that's been in the trade will feel nostalgic the way that us old buggers perhaps do now, So, and I'm speaking of someone who's been away from the trade for 25 years, but you still have that pool. I found that very moving, that film tonight, and it impressed upon me how still I do feel quite attached.
And regarding how you got started, was that through apprenticeship or?
It was, an apprenticeship. Yeah. But my grandfather was in the print trade. My father was in the trade reluctantly. His father more than pushed him in towards it. So as a child, I'd always been going around print shops. There was no coercion in the part of my father, but I was always quite fascinated by the pre-press side of things, and I was quite happy to go into it. Father did ask that. He said, if you go into the trade, I don't want you working in the same place as me. And I can understand that. When the Biddy Grieve closed when I was 40, a friend and I looked at the possibility of starting our own business, but I knew by then at 40 I'd had quite enough of print. And he went off and started on his own, and he's very successful. He is Alba Print. But I'd had enough at 40.
And regarding apprenticeships and the sort of contemporary story of print, if I can bring you in, Johnny, could you just tell us a little bit more about Out of the Blueprint, and specifically the sort of young people's engagement work that you do as well, which I suppose is the modern equivalent of apprenticeships in print?
So Out of the Blueprint is a studio complex in Leith, which provides spaces for artists and creative folk to do run their own enterprises. And about 10 years ago, we quite often would be sent young folk who at school, would be told, right, you're arty, you go to the art centre. So they would arrive at the art centre and then end up in the cafe. So working the coffee machine and kind of wondering, well, I thought I was arty, why am I doing this? So we sort of figured, how could we actually run a traineeship scheme that would bring young folk into the building, and what we came upon was having a little micro business which would serve the print needs within the studio complex. Young folk would come in, school leavers or trainees from school would come and work the machines. And yeah, that's kind of where it started about 10 years ago or so. The machines we run are not quite as they're highly engineered, but they're beautifully engineered by Japanese engineers who everything is lovely components. But it's they came up with these machines, Riso machines, essentially as an educational tool that is cheap duplication that would go into every single school in Japan. So they're dead easy to use. They're quite labor intensive. There's quite a lot of swapping ink drums and there's so we have to sort of do each color layer separately. So it's like screen printing, but without a lot of the hanging around and the washout and the chemicals and stuff. So it's really good for working with young folk, and there's no real hiding place for them. They've got to engage with you. They've got to swap over drums. They've got to talk. They've got to take part in that sort of cake making process of work where you're just moving on station to station. So
I visited quite recently, and it's just there's such a wonderful energy about that, even that wee room, and just how it's sort of this micro industry that's going, and it's such a tactile process, and it feels like such a good marriage between that real tactility of print and the more traditional forms of it, but also with a digital sort of process associated therein as well. Which speaks to that young person's kind of world as well.
Yeah. It's kind of like it started off as that training program, if you like, but it's become a social enterprise now where we do, we get about 60% of our income from commercial print jobs, and we do a lot of the sort of printing that probably would happen at Dunwoody's, the local community fairs, events, flyers for gigs and clubs and posters. So that's the work that we do to raise the income that the trainees work on. But in addition to that, a lot of what we do is support. We're set up to support under 25s, so we do that through traineeships, but also by helping them to create their own material. So we print a lot of comics. We do a lot of short runs of comics. We print pamphlets, poetry, compilations, zines. But yeah, supporting young folk to make stuff.
It's fantastic. It's really do check it out, and do look at Riso printing as well, because it's become my latest obsession a little bit. And Karen, I'd like to bring you in from for more journalistic and engaged end of print and the actual content of media these days. And am I right in saying you were the co-founder of the community newsroom? No,
of the newsroom.
The newsroom, yeah. Yes, and you are the co-editor of the Ferret. Correct. Right, I got my notes right. Could you just enlighten us, what factors contributed to the establishment of the Ferret and the newsroom, or rather your engagement with it, and how do these initiatives operate to promote more transparency, community engagement and independent journalism? Sure. A nice easy one for you.
I'm like, wow, I didn't know how I was going to fit in with all of this. But yeah, I guess... The Ferret is an online-only publication. So, I'm the oddity on this panel. And it was set up in 2015. I'm not one of the founders, but the point of that was really because there was a crisis in terms of the media's investment in investigative journalism specifically. And that feeling from the founders that something really important for democracy was going to be lost in terms of that continued lack of investment. And I think where that fits in with the journey of print really is because, the model of journalism has changed so much as that kind of print history has changed and developed. When we look at the history of where newspapers would have been when this, when these print presses were, in their heyday, you would have had adverts, you would have had, a real sort of commercial, engaged community in behind every local newspaper, national newspaper. And as that changed and the model became, which was basically that advertisers would pay for newspapers, which then could be sold at affordable prices. When that was broken, newspapers started to hemorrhage staff. We now have a situation across the UK where about 4 million people are living in what are termed news deserts. So, you're not having access to local news, for example. And so the Ferret really was about how do we find a way of collectively ensuring that content isn't lost, and do that in a way that's, cooperative, democratic, accessible. And for us, that was online. So, we still don't do any print. We share a newsroom now in Govan Hill with a community magazine called Greater Govan Hill Magazine, which, you should check out because it's beautiful. The print and the design is very much central to their publication, and they kind of promote sort of solutions type journalism. So we sort of do quite different things within the community newsroom space. But what we do, I think, in the newsroom space together is very much about engagement. So while we might at the Ferret not have a tangible print product, we do a lot of engagement work with events and films and that type of stuff around the country. Particularly in the newsroom, we do now an open editorial meeting, for example, once a month on different topics. And we have a mixture of people with lived experience, with professional experience, with activist backgrounds, all coming around an issue, and that goes into then what we produce online.
That's a really fascinating model in terms of that openness of the sort of editorial process. I suppose you often think quite a subjective form, that sort of journalistic approach to things, but it's really broadened that picture and actually made it very collective and inclusive and co-creative. So it's a really remarkable thing. And just when you were mentioning earlier about just, the real dearth that's happening now. And Judith, I don't suppose, has there ever been a sort of comparable time within our local history or even, national history where that might have been similar? Or
I suppose there hasn't really been a time when there was something and it was lost. There was an absence before, there never used to be any legislation really in Britain saying you can't print anything. They just made paper so expensive that you couldn't print anything. So it made it prohibitive to most people by the Stamp Act. But Dumfries really, it's... when I was saying earlier, it's like you think things happened in Dumfries and even Dumfries or just Dumfries. Well, that isn't really the case when it comes to newspaper printing. Dumfries was very much at the vanguard of newspaper printing. The very first paper printed in Dumfries was the Dumfries Mercury, which was printed probably either 1715. The very first one that exists is from 1721. And it's believed, and people disagree, it's either the very first newspaper not printed in Edinburgh in Scotland, or it's the very first newspaper not printed in Edinburgh or Glasgow in Scotland. So it's a very, very, very early newspaper, and it was printed by a quite radical and interesting person called Peter Ray, or the Robert Ray Press as it was. And that led to really interesting developments in Dumfries with a very liberal press. in Dumfries. That's, they had one Liberal paper, and then they had a split in the church in 1843, and they ended up with two Liberal papers in Dumfries, one on one side of the church argument, one on the other. So they agreed on politics but disagreed on church matters. Very much in Dumfries, the press was liberal, and the press was reporting on things, and it's quite interesting when you see the reports on different issues, the different tone taken by the different presses, the different newspapers, and also the fact that some of the key people involved in the newspapers in Dumfries were also key social reformers. So Henry Duncan, of course, whose statue stands down the end of the road, also Andrew McDermott, and William McDowell, who most people know as the local historian, was also the editor of the Standard for a long period of time, and was a secretary of the local Chartist movement as well. So he was not only reporting the news and reporting on the issues in a fair way, fair to the working class protests that were taking place, but he was actively involved in those as well. So when there was a decision that no protests could take place in Dumfries, that was a decision that was taken, that they needed to have public quiet. The Chartists broke that and had a protest at their usual meeting at Queensberry Square, and McDowell's paper reported on that very favourably as saying, well, by what right to the provost stop the people of Dumfries going into the street and meeting publicly? They're not agitating, they're not doing anything wrong, they're meeting to discuss political reform, political ideas. And the other papers published slightly differently, so you can see the tone and the political agenda even in those early days. So I think we had all of those things. It seems like we've lost those things. Dumfries had, I think, at 1.5 newspapers. And yes, they were almost all on the high street as well. So this really was the hub of printing in the town.
Yeah, fascinating. In a bit of prep today, I looked up, it was an interesting map. And it was actually the Guardian article that was in regards to the sort of dearth of independent journalism. And yeah, I suppose just for the sort of Dumfries element here, I mean, that echo, I mean, that radicalism of the print and the actual working class movements, etc. Do you personally see that? Do we feel that still? Do we have a sense of that industry? Is the heart of it still beating now?
I work for the council, so I make no political statements one way or the other. I mean, it's not my observation of it is no. I don't get that feeling. Of just trying to look at it objectively and taking a step back. It feels like there were firebrands and radicalism in Dumfries. I think there still are, but are they at the fore? Are they to the fore? I'm not sure. Maybe they're coming. Maybe certainly in print media or in dominant media. I don't necessarily think that's the case at the moment, but I'd happily take other people's thoughts and hide.
Yeah. Well, I suppose back to Karen, I suppose, in terms of that, what role do you think potentially investigative journalism does in serving the public interest, particularly in places like Dumfries or smaller communities, where local issues may not always receive the national attention? I suppose.
Sure. I mean, I think what's really interesting about what you were saying there about there being, 5 newspapers on the high street, and that sense of accountability that you have when you can actually go up to the newsroom and you can say, at the desk, I didn't like your story on page 3. I thought you were wrong, and I want to see the journalist. Now we have, the main kind of publishers in terms of news organisations in Scotland. You'd be hard pressed to even get past reception, and you'd have a lot of journalists who'd be working at home. So part of our kind of whole thing about having this little newsroom space, and it is just a little sort of, the Ferret is based right around Scotland, and we have journalists in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Highlands, and Fife. but we have got this newsroom because it's a shop front. You can walk in the door, you can speak to our journalists, you can, have that immediate sort of accountability. And I think there's a real issue just now around trust in the media as well. So you've got these kind of two forces of, on one hand, media disappearing, but then on the other hand, fewer people than ever before trust the media. The latest figures from January this year, where I think only about a third of people in the UK trust the media, which is an absolutely damning indictment for people like me, but that is because you don't, that bond of trust has been broken, and it's about how do we put that back. I think that's a really important question if we want to think about democracy, and we think about how investigative journalism can not only shine a light on really fundamental problems, but also really kind of engage again with the public in a way that they will believe that. We live in this such a polarized world, and, we're here talking about print and the really kind of like physicality of print and the opposing force of that, I suppose, with online, where you have social media driving this kind of real polarization of views. I think investigative journalism got a really important role to play in what it can tell people, but it also has to work on engaging with the public and rebuilding that trust and re-establishing that bond, from my perspective.
Yeah, please come in.
I'm just really struck by the fact that you have outlets not just in Glasgow, and I think keeping it local is such a thing, because it's very different when the media is always happening somewhere else, and then you don't have access to the people that are actually producing it for you. We're in the room here tonight with Willie Johnson here, who chose to stay here, and it puts you in a very different position. I know this as a filmmaker myself. It's, when you're forced to queue up at the post office for a pint of milk with people who you may have covered, or it puts you in a different relationship with subject matter and local population and stories. And that, I think, is gone, and I think it's a great dearth.
I mean, just to clarify that slightly, the newsroom in Glasgow is the only one that we have as a but we do have people around Scotland, and we've got 2,500 members from across Scotland who, there's never enough hours in the day at the minute. We'd like to do more with our membership, but at least there's that kind of feeling of, our members are our owners. We don't have any billionaire owners. We don't have a corporation. We don't have adverts. So yeah, there's more of that, hopefully more of that connection with people.
I suppose kind of what are the sort of, aside from the sort of the slightly devastating figures that you sort of read out there, but what are fundamentally the primary challenges and opportunities that this type of approach, can address and give people, is the impact beyond even just the information? Is it actually growing, advancing careers, and is there a wider impact that this marriage of perhaps even print and journalism in and of itself can have for communities or places?
I mean, I absolutely believe so. And actually this week I was giving a talk at the Scottish Drug Forum, and I have done a lot of stuff around the overdose crisis and how grassroots media actually has a role to play in, sounds grandiose, but in saving lives. If you can get information into the right hands, information is power. That's what really everybody's been sort of saying here, whether that's, inciting violence, but actually keeping food and feeding people, and again, keeping them alive. And I think there still is that kind of way in which making those links and giving people agency through media can be a really important part of community building, of placemaking, and therefore can help to not only shine a light on the difficult way in which safety nets have been dissolved, but try and put them back. So I think there's definitely this sort of community building aspect to telling stories, and that's really what the content of media is. It's storytelling, and that can be in zine form, like you're talking about. I mean, I was looking at graffiti in Vancouver, and the way that, Smokey D, who's a graffiti artist who's also had personal experience of the drug crisis himself, is making murals about, how to use drugs safely, or memorializing someone who's died, and that kind of street news, actually bringing people together. It's not printing, but it's these other ways of sharing information, sharing stories, and sharing news. And I think, media can still be a really important part of that.
I think there's something about you'd mentioned agency, and I think that's like really, really key. I was quite interested. You were saying there was like 50 people working in that one print operation, and then about 200 people in so that industry. And there's probably a paper mill somewhere in Dumfries, or the paper was probably coming from somewhere local, but the local economies would have all been much, much shrunken. And it's not just about accountability in terms of journalists, it's also about the stories are here as well, and that humaneness about a certain closeness. There was talks about sort of how the internet would open up sort of citizen journalism, and actually what it's done is it's sort of made things further away. And I think the Ferret's more of about trying to get back to particularly a Scottish and the environmental stuff, I know that you do. That's kind of like, no, it actually matters to come. There's stuff that comes close. So again, I think it's about giving people agency, because otherwise, if they're just passive consumers of news from afar, it's deadening, and it's deadening for democracy as well. So a big part of the zines is letting people realize that how they express themselves is important, and for teenagers it's important, but for all of us it's important as well that we express ourselves and have agency, and realize that we have a part.
I love the term street news there. That's sticking out to me. It's giving me lots of ideas. Johnny, just to continue a little bit more within the vein of the print element, obviously Riso is it's quite an eco-friendly process. Do you see a potential resurgence because you're very engaged obviously with lots of different kind of studios that are happening now in Scotland? Do you see a resurgence in traditional forms of printing due to sort of more environmental concerns? And do you think that sort of environmental sort of awareness might actually lead us to a more localized, agency-driven, values-led media? I
think that there's... I had to give a talk about... So Riso's based on rice bran. The solvent it uses isn't petrochemical solvent. It's food from a byproduct of the food industry, rice bran oil. But I had to give... I was trying to find out some stats about the sustainability and the eco credentials, and the paper industry is huge, and the lobbying power of the paper industry is really interesting. But they were trying to counter this idea of online and that actually paper from a sustainable source with ink from a sustainable source. And if your energy is from a sustainable source, then it should therefore be more sustainable perhaps than huge data farms with, very weighty junk, digital junk sort of, filling up ad infinitum. So yeah, what was your question again, Martin?
Something in regards to the environmental crisis and how Riso may, or more of those traditional.
I think, like I say, the days of 50 people in one industry and 5 papers and the sort of the global, the distance of the distribution chains and stuff, is contra to all of that, but the humaneness, the sort of the dehumanizing of late capitalism is, I think, something that we all kind of feel, and especially in sort of online spaces, and how what was perhaps a more creative space and where people had some agency to take part has become just very alienating. And so actually, I think, for us, we use the printmaking not to compete, but just to bring people together and to create community. And it's a tool for community development. And that's that. It doesn't have to be more than 10 or 20 or 50 or whatever. It's enough to have people working together. And then the production's one thing, because the important things then is distribution and how you get that out there. That's a kind of secondary thought.
Yeah. Oh, it's great you brought in the sort of human stories here. So Pete, beautifully, you sent me a couple of your own work, and well, actually not fiction at all. Really, it's sort of accounts.
Usually, I do write fiction, but they're more autobiographical than other stuff, perhaps. Yeah. And
I feel quite greedy because I'm the only one that's read this. So, yeah. But a couple of the stories that you've sent me along, and the ones that I've really enjoyed, were particularly in connection to the human people, the stories, the relationships, the real humanity of what was found within that industry. Do you have any personal reflections or memories or what have you that you would really treasure within that time?
I'm going to be rather precious here. I've got quite a lot. They're currently in a novel which is at editing stage, so they'll stay there for the moment. Sorry.
Okay. All right. When will we be able to see that? Will it be Riso printed? Will we do it?
You have to ask potential publisher. There's a collection of short stories coming next year. That won't happen until perhaps a year after.
Great. Okay, well,
so
I feel
we'll come back in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Fantastic. And if you ever want a venue to launch it, you know where to come. I suppose I'd just like to sort of open it out, I guess, if anyone has any sort of reflections or questions, similarly with the audience as well, if anyone would like to come in to the panel or has any comments that they would like to make. Or not.
I'm Willie Johnson. I was a journalist for 42 years, the first 8 of which were across the road at the Standard, when it was still the hot metal print work. So the film, again, brought back an awful lot of happy memories of the print works across there. Probably for Karen and Judith, mainly, the loss of local democracy and accountability with the demise of local newspapers is really worrying. Investigative journalism is important, but it's expensive, and it only covers a relatively small number of subjects. The minutiae is also important, and that's what's been being lost. Back in the day, all of the organisations that ran life in Dumfries and Galloway were here, and they met here, and they were open to the press and public, and we went along and reported them in pretty much, great detail. That's been lost, and I guess from a journalist point of view, and also from a historical point of view, these were publications of record and important for local history, and that's being lost. Quantify if you can. What is being lost?
Okay. So I agree with you. And investigative journalism is expensive, and it's increasingly difficult to cover things in the depth that we should be covering them in, because there's so much, right? You're under such sort of deluge of people coming in, and I agree with you. I think what is being lost is significant, but also I think that what we need now might have changed slightly. And I think that what the Ferret does do is it proves that a model of community ownership of media is working. We're going to be 10 years old next year. And as much as anything, I think that we've done that is really something that is noteworthy and that I'm proud of personally. And I think, we've seen the kind of the movement of community ownership of buildings. And what about other parts of our heritage and history? And I think that would be a really interesting thing to think about locally. We have a membership model. About a third of our income at the moment comes from membership. We also do content sales. And, we also do have grants, and we'd like to move to a point where we don't. But for example, imagine a situation in which you had community-owned media around Scotland, which was then feeding into national media, and you put that kind of that structure back in where you were really kind of coming from the grassroots up. And I think that would be incredibly exciting, and I'd love to see what communities themselves, rather than the companies that owned local newspapers, drove and could bring to the table in terms of informing democracy and actually pushing and driving for positive change.
I think there has been a loss of local accountability and local democracy, but I think also an organisation like the Ferret is important now as well, because I referred earlier to the local organisations all meeting in Dumfries and being based in Dumfries. Now there is a great deal of centralisation and a great deal more secrecy. And really, organisations like the Ferret are needed to pry into what's really going on.
We are, but I think it's about devolving that out. So, there's some exciting projects in place in some of the American cities just now where public interest news is really kind of, in its current iteration, is much ahead of the UK. And so they do a citizen journalism project in Detroit, for example, where they have a newsroom, where they have a group of people, they're paid volunteers who go and make sure they sit in every single city council meeting, and then they report back on that. And sometimes that'll just be about creating a public record of that meeting so that you can read it on the website. But sometimes they'll create stories, and sometimes they'll hold public meetings and town hall type events where they'll make sure that their community is informed. Someone else runs a tip line where, you can phone in and ask a question and say, I don't know what the city's doing about this. And that little team will go and find out. And I think these kind of like more innovative, kind of democracy focused information gathering, storytelling, kind of, if we could try and kind of put some of that into our current environment would be great. We need, as you say, to kind of cut through that secrecy and that, we've had freedom of information legislation for quite a long time now in Scotland, but yet I know that as a journalist, when I was working, I worked for Sunday Times, for example, and we do these regular things where we would phone every city council press office and put a, story about education or health or something like that. And you just would be able to get that information within a week. And now you have to wait 20 days and appeal when they don't give you the information. And actually, there's questions about whether that's made things more transparent or given people another layer of legislation to hide behind. And at times that can be problematic.
From Judith's point of view, how concerned are you at the sort of the loss of this historical record?
Well, I'm much more comfortable talking about the past than the present. I think like sort of journalism is sort of history's first draft, I think is always sort of, and I feel much more comfortable taking a step back and seeing the longer view. So I'm not entirely sure I'm like in my comfort zone here, but in terms of the thinking about the past and thinking about what's similar to today, I think that, there is a danger of always I would always view the past with a critical eye, and try and interrogate and inquire and analyse the available evidence. And I think there's always a danger of being nostalgic about what's been lost, and and perhaps time will tell the good or the bad or the ill of it. I couldn't say. And the trends that we're all subject to, they're not in anyone's governance or control, and you can only affect the change that you can affect, I suppose, is how I feel about it. But in terms of, what's been lost from the historical record, it seems like there used to be a plethora of opinions and different approaches, and there used to be the real grassroots journalism and connection with place. There used to be proper reporting of speeches and things like that, and you would get word for word verbatim accounts, and just the records that have been lost and the skills and trades that have been lost as well. And I certainly feel that when you look at the high street and you feel you see the photographs, one of the photographs we had in the film, this collection of people, the vibrancy that's been lost in the town. But I still feel hopeful. I feel like, there are organisations and there are things happening in the town that make you feel like change is afoot, and we're here having this conversation, which makes me feel hopeful. And I think of the people in the past and the difficulties that they faced and the times they must have felt very bleak, but we knew that change is around the corner. So who knows, we could be on the tide of change. And certainly when I was reading about organised protest in Dumfries in the past and some of the collective actions, and it's going to sound incredibly cheesy and like I'm creeping up to our hosts this evening, but it did make me think the Stove are doing so many things that actually the people of the past they were wanting to see that. They were wanting to see community activism, engagement. They were wanting to think about who should be in charge, who should have a voice, who should have a say. And the Stove are doing it in a different way, creatively, through events and other types of engagement. But I do feel like there's still those people in the town, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. I suppose you can look at the big scheme of the world and feel so small and powerless, and then actually think, well, we do have power, but there are things we can't control. So that's how I feel about it, I suppose.
I don't want to hog this, but just a very quick anecdote on journalism being the first draft of history. I remember filing into a press conference in Lockerbie in the early hours of the 22nd of December, 1988, the first press conference after the Lockerbie disaster. And journalists in the 5 or 6 hours since it happened had been coming into the town from all over the place, including, I think it was Alistair Stewart from ITN. And as we were filing into this press conference, he sort of muttered to no one in particular, "Don't forget, guys, it's history you're writing tonight." And he was right. Yeah.
It could be a wee shudder. I think it was a really lovely message there of hope with regards to much of the sort of progress and the activism and the localization and placemaking, whatever you might call it, all the myriad, the Venn diagram of all these kind of initiatives that are happening. And interestingly, at our AGM, we hosted Dr. Ducky, Dr. Ben Walters, and he was exploring this concept of homemade mutant hope machines, which please do Google that if you can remember it. That's homemade mutant hope machines, which is very much the concept of people with perhaps little agency, or perhaps perceived little agency, being able to reclaim and gather and almost be subjective within their own culture, because that community of interest, which also media and journalism and print for myself certainly serves, is this real tactile way of engaging and hopefully moving our town forward and Scotland forward in a broader sense. So with that said, just like to open it out for any closing remarks. If there's anything the panel would like to sort of close with, or what kind of future you might wish to see from after this discussion. You made the tut thing.
I'm encouraged by this discussion, actually, hugely, because when we talk about media, there has actually, I forget the name of it, but there was a kind of move to have kind of local network of online TV, a component of which was obviously going to be news gathering. It seems to have slightly petered out, to be honest. And I did wonder at the time that moving image media, it's got a huge technology barrier, and also a barrier to access as well. More so now that our televisions don't work anymore. You got to go online and have broadband to get to see anything. But to think that there might be a concentration on the written word, whether that's digitally produced or something that you can hold in your hand, and a concentration on actual journalism and investigation as well, I think is really crucial. And I certainly hope that something is being kindled here around about that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I suppose, that I feel like one of the things in Dumfries is there is a lot of great stuff happening, but maybe people don't know about it or connect it, and they don't connect it together. It's like a little patch of good here, a little patch of good there, a little patch of good there, and actually you start thinking, well, the critical mass is actually quite great, really. It's not just patchiness, but is that because of how people perceive themselves and their communities, and is that because of the media, that how they see themselves in the mirror? Is that that everything's glamorous and great somewhere else and everything's rotten and rubbish in our town? Is that because of the way how the mirror reflects, if you see what I mean, or do you get the journalism you deserve? I don't know the answer to that, but it just feels like I feel very positive about the town and all the people that I meet, and but time and time again I hear people say, but no one knows about it, or no one cares about it, or no one is, amplifying it and connecting it together. And I suppose it's only through talking to each other that we can really get that started.
Thanks. It's interesting. When you were talking there, I was thinking about, Poor Things is in the cinemas just now, or and Alistair Gray always talks about, no one knew what Glasgow was like in the imagination until it's written about. It's that sort of, you can imagine things when people tell stories about them. And I think about the difference, or that kind of like disconnect sometimes between the individual experience and the collective experience at the moment. And I really think that stories come out of people understanding that their individual experiences are not just individual, that they are collective. And I love seeing in a room when people make that connection and they realize that they are actually, maybe this isn't just my problem. Maybe this is actually a structural problem, and maybe this is actually something that we need to raise attention to. And then you can combine that kind of understanding of the structure with those individual stories. And so I think sitting here in the Stove and seeing the sort of movement building that the Stove and places like the Stove, like at the Blue, are doing, and kind of the work that you're doing with young people, and kind of giving them that agency, is what I think will start to kind of build from the grassroots up, and hopefully we'll try and kind of readdress those broken structures that we've been talking about, and create new smells and sounds of a both print and digital future.
I'm just caught up. I would love to fix the macro, but that it's absolutely huge, and I can't work at that scale. So I just think working on the micro and making connections, and giving people agency to say that they matter, that their opinions, their experience matters, and for me, putting it in print is a really good way to help people articulate it, to help artists articulate it, writers and poets and all the rest, but also then encapsulate it. And, I sort of say print goes a bit further than digital, because I think people read it a bit different. You can also, geographically, it can sort of go further and not just get lost in the digital kerfuffle of life, but also it can be put on a shelf in a library, and 20 years from now, you can come across something, and that's for me the thing that I think, there's a bit of that in terms of the film, is how the actual ephemera of life helps us to think about how other people dealt with micro and the macro.
I've got a dreadful admission to make that the stove and me have been relative strangers all this time. I used to write and publish quite a lot. Then I got involved in social work and was based in court for nearly 20 years. It's only since retiring a couple of years back that I've got back involved in the art scene, only becoming properly aware now what the stove's up to. And I think it's doing a marvellous job, and I'm glad that I've made proper contact. I re-established contact with the local heritage of the museum recently as well, and discovered that what I thought was once a very moribund product is actually alive and kicking now. Politically, I'm a pessimistic type of person. I'm a socialist. I don't see any signs of socialism anywhere. But at least looking at the grassroots that are sprouting locally, I feel much more optimistic than I perhaps did before. And keep it all up. It's marvellous work you're all doing.
Well, on behalf of the stove and everyone that's arrived, thank you sincerely. I think that was one of the highlights of my month, if not year so far. So thank you so much. Cheers.